come up in the discussion that there are varied forms of corruption in which complicity of agents acting as instruments for the purposes of agencies above them in a hierarchy becomes the normative method for the engagement of certain types of fraud which could not otherwise be conducted. These instrumentalities, they shall be called, take as many forms as there are forms of human action. When it comes to the fundamental nature of coercion and deception, there are many classical forms of human instrumentality which accomplish the purposes of coercive or deceptive effects. It must be, first of all, reiterated that coercion and deception are techniques of warfare, and that the fundamental form of warfare is between those who favor as a way of life coercion and deception, and those who resort to it only in self-defense once they've been attacked by those very same methods. So, for example, in a just society, the law and order which exists, let's just say, for example, the common law or the civil law, consider criminal activity punishable by coercion, and coercive actions outside of that specific frame of reference are prohibited and are punishable by countermeasures which are themselves coercive. In other words, being detained, arrested, incarcerated, sentenced, judged summarily by society according to the simple question of was the law broken or not. So civilization in this context, in a legal context, is structured fundamentally on the basis of an ongoing form of warfare between those who can get along with the idea of law and order in proper senses of the terms, not necessarily just according to someone's dictates. In other words, on principles of justice. And those who are not content with that and wish to operate outside the proper contractually arranged parameters of being a member of the public, i.e. persons who have the rights and obligations of being citizens in a republic. That's a member of the public, a citizen. So basically, there are those who will circumvent, wherever possible, that arrangement when it favors them to do so, as long as they can get away with it. We call them criminals. Now, it just so happens that organized crime, the most intelligent and sustainable form of criminal activity, can become institutionalized in certain forms and is found at the root of the basis of much of our institutions of authority. But also, institutions of authority which are not themselves criminal in nature or function can become corrupted. So in two forms, organized criminal activity can pervade the social environment. Well, given that condition where these agents are acting on behalf of other agents, sometimes in institutionalized form, in other words, agencies, these agents are acting as the express instrument of, and willingly acting as the express instrument of the controlling agents or agencies. In other words, they're acting as extensions of their will, and that's exactly what their function is, whether it's by delegated or by more strictly controlled protocols of action. But it's for some intended result, and that intended result is the motive of the agent which initiates the sequence of actions that leads to the final end product, which is, in the case of organized crime, where the rubber hits the road, where the criminal act is conducted. So speaking more specifically about a specific sort of criminal activity called racketeering, and later on a subset of that activity, let us call it stalking, harassment, or other forms of, as the East Germans called it, corrosion, methods of counterintelligence operations, which, if conducted against any target, makes that target a de facto enemy of those conducting the operation. In other words, it is an act of warfare. The term counterintelligence suggests, briefly, it suggests the idea that one is defending oneself against an act of warfare. But coming back to the more general idea of basically subterfuge as an activity of criminal action, as a form of criminal action, in a specific sort of way, is called racketeering. So subterfuge conducted for the sake of, by presenting a false appearance of one kind, obtaining, therefore by fraud, a result. Because of handling other features of the event, but not presenting this as the truth to the other party. So one form of racketeering. So those that type of activity, racketeering, involves the presentation of a front behind which to conduct other activities which are gainful to the agent using that front, but which might not be permitted and might not therefore be possible by the other party being engaged through that front if they knew about the other activities going on behind it. So in other words, that front might not be treated as legitimate by the other party if it were known that it were being used as a cover or a screen for other activities. Likewise, also, if the activities serve a purpose other than is expressly announced or reasonably expected to be the case, and also if other kinds of information are withheld, which would be critical to the judgment of the other party as to their stake in participating with that agency which is operating through the front. If the front is legitimate, then it will be in line with certain norms of fairness, where it's expected that one is not presenting an appearance in order to deceptively engage in activities or toward ends which the other party would not be reasonably expected to understand is going on, and for whom it might be important to know about those activities or ends, because they may choose not to be involved in that or may not approve of it. In fact, if those other activities happen to also be criminal and not just maybe shameful or awkward or improper in some way, but actually criminal, then all other parties than those operating behind the front would want to know about it, according to the social contract of the Constitution and all of the laws consequent to that, as well as by common law, natural law, and divine law. So basically, to assert a front as legitimate, which acts as a screen for other activities, is a form of racketeering, because, again, racketeering presents a front and then dissociates that front from activities and ends which are sought behind the cover that front provides, the screen that it provides, against what would have been ethically proper, against the grain of what would have been proper according to the other parties. So it's a form of fraud, and that's a form of subterfuge. So, a subterfuge, which is a fraud, which is a racket, involves using a front in order to deceive other parties about what is taking place behind that front. So that means whether or not the other activities were the first and primary set of activities, and their goals were the first and primary set of goals for the agent, and then a front was added to it, or whether or not there was already a legitimate front, public front, in existence that was then later corrupted and used for unlawful and or immoral or other improper purposes. Those are tantamount to the same result, that it is a racket. So organized crime fundamentally is a racket. One example of that is a protection racket, where thugs come around to an establishment or some other agency or agent and convince that person to pay them a fee for their protection against the possibility of basically to pay them to be their enforcers or police force against a threat of perhaps vandalism or some other form of coercion, robbery, any other kind of encroachment. And then if that fee is not paid, then the same agent initiates criminal activities for which protection would be sought by that group, the other party, with whom they're trying to contract to the front of being protectors. Or in fact, they're the ones causing the harm when their protection is not sought. That's a racket. It falls right under the definition. So looking closely at the nature of power over the entire course of history, and as it plays out in our modern context, which is a technologically augmented modification of our historical precedents, we are in a situation where certain rackets have been in place for a long time and have extended thoroughly into our modern society. The seemingly perennial reach of their corruption, which is the natural tendency of a racket, since it wants to create a reality where it's the exception to the rule, and yet cannot overtly enforce that. If it can overtly enforce that exceptionalism, then it's no longer considered a racket but a legitimate authority in certain cases, such as royal power or other autocratic or dictatorial forms of power. But when it comes to organized crime in a more general context, we could look at the other interests and concerns rather than simply the archaic forms of coercive power, which have been the political norm for so long. We can see that modern forms of government are yet nested within a context of autocratic power, going back to their historical origins, but also considering the current context of their lateral relations with their ancestral roots, and say, for example, America's connection to Europe. So therefore the royal powers there, who are continuing with their racket quite successfully, including also the papal authority, is which is the oldest racket that I know of, that has a public front that's considered legitimate, are operating through the Federal Reserve institution, which is a racket, a counterfeiting racket, and basically through that and the war industrial complex, and now the anti-terror bullshit statist covert fifth column apparatus, which encompasses DHS and all the law enforcement agencies that can be made rogue in whole or in part, and the intelligence agencies, who have a perverse lineage going back to the same old autocratic powers. Partly through infiltration, but mainly through their very founding. There's a pervasive racket run through the entire society, American society, and other Western powers, and really all the nation states of the world in one form or another, which manifests as a kind of a process of coercion involving psychological warfare techniques, subterfuge, harassing or haranguing the foe, which is a technique that scouting units in the military are proficient at. Information warfare, gathering of intelligence, its analysis and dissemination against targeted agents, whether in counterintelligence or in straightforward intelligence activities. These forms of subterfuge, whenever they are brought into a certain context of application in society, have to be legitimized through a front, which makes them appear to the participants and to those who have a rationale for interacting with those participants on a legal level. They need to have certain pretexts in order to give themselves a sense of legitimacy so that they can carry on their activities efficaciously. Right? They have to have a sense of confidence and rightness about their actions, or else they will obviously not be very good at them. And that doesn't presume that they'll be good at them anyway, but just that it's a necessary minimum for them to think that they have the moral high ground, or at least the legal high ground in their activities. They have to at least be confident enough to follow through with them, and that's essential when it comes to activities involving direct human presence. So, getting closer to the mark, we're talking about a specific form of racketeering involving psychological warfare techniques. And the technologies which augment it today have made it exponentially a more serious concern than it would have been without their involvement. Though that will be addressed in the next video, but in this one we're just talking about the ancient substrate upon which that technology is deployed, the racketeering activity of coercive power extending its reach into the lower strata of society through agencies that mimic being loyal to their in groups, their publicly manifest in groups, but they're actually acting as the eyes and ears and sometimes the hands of other agencies. And if this were known about them, they would be viewed differently by their peers, as well as those others who know them. Therefore, that fact is kept hidden, so they can continue operating under the cover of being just one of these other folks, right? And these people are very much despised by those who are not in on their scheme and have been fooled by them into thinking that there's nothing else to them other than how they presented themselves. There might be some differences in attitude based upon the question of whether they had always been shills or if they were recruited into becoming shills after already being members of that society or subset of society in which they were operating. But that question is secondary to the main issue of how they're operating as instrumentalities for concerns which do not wish the fact of their being instruments to be made publicly or manifestly known in context where they're operating, and that the operations they're conducting involve psychological warfare techniques, whether they know it or not, and that these can be enumerated precisely and their modes of application practically in the real world and in real time can be demonstrated, can be even recorded and detailed and analyzed in ways that clearly show empirically that what I'm talking about not only exists, but show in living color how it is actually manifested for those who are not experienced with it. But it doesn't take a Tom Clancy or a Bill Maher to understand how these structures of power, or Michel Foucault for that matter, understand how these structures of power manifest through information asymmetry. Again, the information asymmetry contained in fraudulent conduct extended as a racket is paramount for its operation, because that information asymmetry is what guarantees that the front can be used as a fulcrum for what's taking place behind it, which would not be guaranteed that same stable freedom to operate, or to operate at all, if it were publicly exposed to the other parties who would be concerned, especially if those are criminal activities, such as running a racket. Always is, but as well as the methods of action, the techniques, and the goals might also be criminal, which are being conducted behind the scenes, such as embezzlement, counterfeiting, harassment, which is the attempt to actively deprive someone else of their liberty and their own freedom to pursue their own happiness and their own life. So that being done covertly, so that action can't be taken against it legally, because the evidence is hidden and the activity itself is hidden. So it's an ongoing, deliberate, organized criminal activity, which makes it a very high crime, which means it can be punished very severely. Life imprisonment is one, or death in the case of treachery of an office or other significant position of trust, where other people's lives would have been perhaps at stake. Now here people are taking it upon themselves to actually conduct psychological warfare activities against other members of society, wittingly or unwittingly. So there's degrees of wittingness, but they're operating to various degrees of culpability and accountability as instruments in an ongoing covert civil warfare activity. And that, of course, is a very serious crime, no matter what the pretext is. And then, of course, that's key to this entire issue, is the pretext, because it has to be legitimized to the participants who have compartmentalized knowledge of their activities, very limited usually on the lowest levels of operation. So that whenever they're told to cough and play these other little yawn games or noise campaigns, or basically acting like a doofus, or hey, I'm the doofus for hire on this block. You need me to go act like a doofus over here? Whatever there's some people that are just cut for the role from birth. Some people acquire the facility of the role, and then some people just happen to seem to fit the role, and that's sufficient. It's basically, it has been sometimes mapped out as a form of activity called street theater. But in this case, it is conducted to appear as though it were not what it is. And it is normal activity, just like extras in the background of a scene in a movie. They're expected to act as if they're not extras, but that they're just other people who don't know there's a movie going on. In the same way, people who are conducting this kind of street theater, which has psychological warfare attributes, would operate under the pretext of being neighborhood watch, being part of a social experiment, just having fun with friends, being asked to engage in proselytizing or anti-demonic activity. Counterintelligence operations, because anti-terrorist operations. There's so many pretexts that can legitimize psychological warfare activity, depending on who's involved and what their level of witting or unwitting involvement is. That it's almost equivalent to all the possible forms of human activity that exist. Because really, this is a form of passive-aggressive behavior, since it's covert, yet is aggressive and hostile. Not just psychologically hostile, but also sometimes physically and in other ways substantially harmful in terms of person and property. So, reputation being included as property of a person. These circumstances make it a very serious crime and make it a very dangerous crime, not just for an individual, but for an entire society. Organized crime operating like a cancer, as it has been made analogous to a cancer by those who are supposedly, it is their job to enforce laws against racketeering. When those agencies become wittingly or through some means of manipulation unwittingly involved in those activities against persons in society who do not properly or cannot be properly assigned a role other than as target, except through some rationalization and pseudo-explanatory narrative projected onto the target. In other words, if it can be shown that basically people who are involved at least are deceived about the legitimacy of their activity, and that the targeted person is in fact harmed or the target of harm in those activities, then they are involved in a criminal act. De facto and de jure. And they are culpable and can be prosecuted by anyone familiar with the law and who has access to sufficient evidence. But however, these powers have been narrowly restricted in some ways to specialized forms of law enforcement, but they're not technically restricted only to their exercise of power, because any citizen can exercise their right to make arrest against someone committing a felony in their presence. And of course, racketeering is a felony. So if it can be shown by any means of hard evidence that persons are involved in a racketeering enterprise of any kind, for any excuse, for any reason, basically that conduct can be investigated and actions can be taken to arrest that conduct, which means to detain or arrest the persons involved, and as part of the continuing investigation into that racket in an attempt to ascertain how far the hierarchy goes and what areas of society it may have infected, such as institutions of law enforcement or chapters of an organization, private organization, or perhaps even businesses or other local concerns or international conglomerates or industries, sectors of industry, and so on. The pattern of behavior has an interest, a method, and seizes an opportunity to actualize as a stream of conduct which is covertly deployed behind the screen of a legitimate front of activity, socio-economic, political, or otherwise.